Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones. So glad you could join us on this chilly post-Halloween morning. My office temperature is 63 degrees right now. Oh, 64. Just went up a degree. So I
I
have my
heard
hat
you.
on today. It's a little chilly. So with that, we'll go ahead and jump back in. We're making our way through the Daodejing, chapter 75 already. And we've got a new design.
Ooh,
So we are, I don't know if this is the final one, but working with this one, kind of doing a little bit of a rebranding here around more of our Taoist themes. So with that, we'll jump into our story.
I like the
Chapter,
colors.
oh, thank you. So chapter 75, we're using the Addiss and Lombardo translation. And it starts off, people are hungry. And I have the character that's being translated as people here. This is the character Ren. And this can mean person or people. So this would be a natural translation. But what's interesting, and I didn't have a chance to sort out why, but there seems to be some discrepancies in some of the underlying Chinese texts that are translated. Whereas there's going to be three sections here, and each of them start off with what's translated here as people, but there's three different terms that are being all translated as people. Some of the texts, when they're showing the Chinese, have all the same character, and others have different characters for each of the three. And I'm not sure where that variation is coming in from, and none of them are really commenting on that. There's another section where there's a variation that we'll talk about that they do comment on, but this one I just didn't have enough time to track down. So I'm going to explore it from the perspective of the three different terms to see how this may bring in a little bit of a nuanced meaning to what we're talking about. But the first one here is how you would normally translate Ren if you were thinking about it in more of a plural term, so people. The other thing is this phrase is rather, it could be taken in a lot of different ways, and people have translated this either as a statement like this or as a question, why are the people hungry? Or as a like when the people are hungry or something along those lines. Another one is if the people are hungry. So it's kind of a little bit open and ambiguous. I think that the way that this is going to make sense from what I've seen is this is maybe it's either a statement like this or I think it's a question. Why are the people hungry? Um, so we'll take it from both of those directions here as we see how this unfolds. It says when rulers tax grain, people, and in this case, it's translating people from they are hungry. And the reason I'm bringing up the fact that they're using the term they here is because it'll make a little bit more sense later on. Um, when you use something like they, it can be a little ambiguous. Is that they referring to the rulers or is that they referring to the people? And it seems in context, and as we flow through this, it's going to refer back to that first line. Why are the people hungry? And then again, it says when the rulers tax grain, the people or they are hungry, right? So, one point we might note here that's kind of interesting. I was reading a book called Against the Grain that has to do with how there's the transition from hunter-gatherers to more of a settled communities and how it worked with moving into more larger structures with hierarchy and what types of crops that they chose to grow. And what was interesting about this is that there are a variety of things that they can grow on larger scales, but they evidently were going for the types of crops that became easier to tax. So you can have things like potatoes or other like tubers that grow in the ground that last for a long period of time, and you can't actually see them. And they can be harvested, and other crops that can be harvested at various times throughout the year. But if you focus on the different grain crops, one of the benefits from a tax collection strategy is that one, you can visually see it, and two, it typically harvests at the same time every year. And so you can organize how you're doing your taxation. And I thought this was fascinating because there's a lot of implications that the types of food that they were growing and what people ate in terms of what type of effect that had on the quality of their life. But it also seems that it was partly directed by what was the easiest to tax. And I thought that was a fascinating piece of information to learn. So here we have an example of that being taken advantage of in the sense of why are the people hungry? Because they're being overtaxed, is the idea here. Now, if that opening statement is a question, why are the people hungry, as opposed to just simply a statement that people are hungry, I think that the direction that would be coming from would be in the voice of the ruler. Like, what is it? Why are all these people claiming to be hungry all the time? Right? Like why aren't they satisfied? Type of a situation. And the response is, well, you're overtaxing them, and that's why they're hungry. So it becomes kind of this interesting dialogue between maybe some ruler presumptions, where maybe they don't recognize the context in which they're creating hunger, and they think people are just being greedy and claiming that they're hungry, kind of like the whole let them eat cake type of a situation. Um, and I think it creates an interesting dynamic, especially as we see how this plays out if we treat the opening line in each of these three sections as a question that maybe is being posed by a ruler who's like, what are you talking about? Why is everybody claiming to be hungry? And then the response is, what the ruler is actually doing to bring about the situation. People are rebellious. Now, here you can see the character that's being translated, people. Actually, there's two characters here, is different than the first one, which was Ren. This is Beijing, which is a way of saying the 100 clans or the 100 last names. And this is a way of talking about like the ruling families within the empire. So here, the first one is more generally, people are hungry. This one is getting at those, maybe the aristocracy, right? The ruling clans within the empire. Why are they now rebellious? And so if we treat this as the question, it's like, why is this class of people not falling into line? Why are they being rebellious? And the response is, when rulers are active, people are rebellious. So again, we see the pattern of the second or the third line using the term they that is being obviously translated as referring to the first line again. And it's answering the question about the rebellion by the middle line when rulers are active, which is seemingly fairly, it could go so many different directions, right? Like, what do you mean they're active? And I think the idea could be that they're overactive, but another way that might be a clue from more of the Taoist perspective is the phrase that's being translated here, are active, is ya, which, if we think about wu and ya, that's the absence and presence. And the term for presence is also this idea of have, right? So, or possess. It's kind of like it exists. And then the second term there in that Chinese phrase is wei, as in wu wei. So within the Daodejing, there's a lot of concern about this idea of wei versus wu wei. And here it's saying that the rulers have wei. So to refresh ourselves on the concept of wu wei, wei can be translated as action or active, it's doing something. So Wu Wei would be non-action or not doing something. But as we've seen, this doesn't mean a passivity. They're concerned about ways of acting that have been more socially derived, that are not natural, that are ways that are conforming to some types of expectations that maybe are problematic from the Taoist perspective. So the idea here then is that the rulers possess a way, and that's WEI, not WAY. And that way here is what we would understand from the Taoist perspective is more of that socially contrived way of doing things, or conventions that are prescribed as opposed to more natural ways of doing things. So there's a way that that the rulers are acting that is encompassing this way that normally, from the Taoist perspective, they would want to avoid, and hence they're promoting the Wu Wei or non-action. You follow that so far? So the rulers are getting involved here in some way, and it's according to maybe tradition or other types of social ways of organizing things that may be out of line with how things would normally be from a more natural perspective. So we have this image of a government that's overly intrusive, first by too many taxes, and here they're getting involved somehow, maybe in terms of regulations or expectations or something that's causing in this case, the ruling clans even to become rebellious. And if we think about the Warring States period in which this is coming about, this is, really making some strong comments about what's causing this social chaos. Why are we in this state? And it's the overactive aspect of those who are in charge over us in terms of overtaxing and being over involved in some way. Any thoughts on this before I continue? Okay, quiet group this morning. Here we go. So the third one, again, we see people and yet a different symbol. And this symbol is min, which is a way that you would say the people, as in like the common people. So it starts off with people just in general. Why are people claiming to be hungry? Then why are the ruling clans rebellious? And now it's just saying, why are in a sense, like the peasants, why are they ignoring death? Or why are they not concerned about death? And the answer here gets a little bit more interesting. And this is another area where we see a little bit of a discrepancy between some of the different underlying Chinese texts that make up the Daodejing. So here it says when, and there's the concept of they in here that was not translated, but it becomes interesting because the question is, well, which they? Is this referring back to the people? But if we've seen how the three different sets of three statements function, the middle section is always dealing with the rulers. So it would make more sense to see this middle section as, again, dealing with the rulers. But you have a variation in the ways that people translate this. Sometimes they translate it as though it's in reference to the rulers, and other times as though it's in reference to the people. And this is where you see a noted variance in the underlying Chinese text, where at least one of the different versions actually has the rulers spelled out in here instead of the more general they. So at least one aspect of how this was being recorded captured the idea more explicitly that this was in reference to, again, the ruler, as opposed to the people more generally. So the statement then is when they, the rulers, are searching only for life's bounty, and bounty here is the concept of thick. And so this could be thought of as like more luxurious or everything that life has to offer kind of an idea, hence why it's translated as bounty. And the response is again, the people ignore death when this is the case. So the thought is that the ruling elites are craving a way of life that demands a great deal of resources, which is why the people are being overtaxed and why they're being overly meddlesome in what the people are doing. And because they're chasing after this way of life, this thick way of life, it's become so desperate in terms of how the people are living that they don't even care about like death because life has become, in a sense, unlivable. And it's interesting when we think about this kind of a critique is that there's definitely the abuse of power that's happening and chasing after a particular way of life. But that way of life is also, in a sense, can be appealing to the underclasses. So we'll frequently see segments of society that will be not critical of that because it's something that they actually want to. It's something that becomes attractive and can force, not force, but suck in more of the population towards this goal of how do we get to this place because it seems like it has so much to offer. And so we've definitely seen in other parts of the Daodejing where they are very critical of, you know, precious goods and lavish food and lavish clothes because these things create an imbalance. It creates a situation where the vast majority are having to suffer greatly, whereas just the higher end seems to be really benefiting from that. And multiple times they talk about like the granaries being empty, the fields being barren, or misuse of that political power resulting in situations that just make life unlivable. Very strong statement here about government action. I mean, it doesn't get much stronger than this particular passage. Before I go on to the conclusion, any thoughts about how this is unfolding with these three statements about taxation and meddlesomeness and the idea of living in luxury?
I think it's quiet because this is the most relatable passage we've had for a while. I think everybody completely understands all of it.
Yeah, it's like, oh, totally. Yep.
Uh, Interesting
So
passage.
I can think of
I'm
to
sorry.
interpret this particular section that's on the screen is that it has to do with something like wealth inequality, meaning if the ruling class has a habit of enriching itself at the expense of the common people, so you have an extreme disparity in wealth, which was the uh, kind of the basis for the French Revolution and let them eat cake is that the ruling class was living in extreme luxury while the common people were living in extreme poverty. Um, then uh, then you get ideas like "give me liberty or give me death," where uh, it would be preferable to die in the service of the cause of liberty than to go on living in subjugation because uh, because of the innate desire for freedom and also because the living conditions may be so poor that death can be seen as a kind of release or escape.
Mhm.
So it's not so much about seeking the good things in life as it is about about wealth disparity
Yeah, the
between
imbalance.
us and the common folk.
Sure. Yeah, and definitely with the previous triplet there where it talks about rebellious, that definitely would apply to what you're talking about. Yeah. I thought it was interesting that this ends up being the chapter that we look at just before the election. So it's kind of a fun little social commentary on, the problems of politics when things get out of control. So yeah, maybe there's a too close to home that's causing everybody to be like, yeah, we understand this one. And to Taylor's point that she's made several times in the past, it's ironic that we seem to keep going through the same thing in history, and yet we are back here again.
I was gonna say it, but I feel like I've said it so many times already in other chapters. Like it's crazy. They were saying these things so long ago, and yet here we are.
Yeah, yeah. It's a little discouraging in some respects.
It's exactly my point.
Yeah.
Like,
Do we
how
not
could this
have?
be, you know?
Yeah. Well, and I think I mean, I'm still wrestling with some of these ideas myself, but I wonder if where we get off track is thinking that we can scale things too big, that in order to actually learn these lessons and implement ways of being in community that are more life affirming, that we might not need to be in smaller groupings, but with our very interconnected world, it becomes difficult to look at doing smaller versus bigger, and the temptation to be bigger in order to have more control is always there, right? So if every country in the world was, the size of France, then, if somebody was, even just twice as big, then all of a sudden they're have an advantage. And so you end up with kind of like this arms race to be bigger and stronger in order to have more influence or to have your way. And to do that, you have to have different ways of bringing the people in line and making them all fit, like the Taoists talk about, that carved wood. How do we shape the people to fit into the boxes that we want them to be in so that we can do what we want to do as a larger, country or empire or whatnot?
I like to see things in terms of dynamically interplaying forces, such as like yin yang essentially being the archetype for that. Such in this case, there's the forces that promote or lead to consolidation, and there's the forces that promote or lead to differentiation. And these are just kind of two aspects of nature or reality or physics. They're like in biology, um, there are forces of consolidation that led to multi-cell or single-celled organisms becoming multi-celled organisms. But there are also forces of differentiation that cause different organisms to differentiate from one another in a certain sense. In a family, there are forces that hold the family together, and there are forces that cause people to differentiate themselves from their family. So rather than being discouraged because the same universal themes are coming up over and over again throughout history, I just see them as universal themes and universal forces that go on playing themselves out in different but similar ways because universal principles are universal.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah, I
when
think.
things happen, they happen for a reason, like the logic of arms race. I actually just finished watching the movie Oppenheimer,
Mm,
which uh, I thought did a great job of highlighting the sort of inexorable logic of the arms race that if we don't do it, if we don't make the bomb, the Nazis are going to make the bomb, and we might not be the best stewards for this kind of power, but the Nazis definitely aren't. So we need to build before them, and there's just a certain inexorable logic to that kind of thing that makes it make more sense to see it as not just a particular human failing or something, but more like an underlying force of the universe. That's of course counterbalanced by things like empathy and compassion, and every force has its opposing force. That's kind of the whole essence of Taoist theory, I think.
Hmm. Yeah, and our current arms race is with the AI, right? Who's and the quantum computing are the two things that are the big race right now. But yeah, there is something to that. I think that ongoing cycle where we see the repeating is helping us to see those patterns. Uh, and I think that where there's always going to be these opposing forces, that if we can identify a way to actually work more in harmony with that, then we might be able to keep it from cycling out of control. So whereas, having this kind of cycle happen between two, family tribes is something that is maintainable on a global scale, having two large portions of the population of the planet do the same thing becomes a whole different scale of problem for everybody, right? So that's the recognition of those patterns becomes important for how do we, if once we realize that this is how things work, how can we intervene in such a way that we can keep more of a balance to that? And that's the big question. And I think,
Schmachtenberger talks about frames it in terms of how do you bind multipolar traps. A lot of his work is about that theme of binding multipolar traps, which include arms races, tragedies of the common, where if we don't do it, the other guys will. How do you bind that sort of thing uh, from turning into a runaway death spiral?
yeah. And I think what we see in the 100 schools of thought in China is kind of the same question. And if we look at the two prominent solutions between Confucianism and Taoism, one is there is a prescripted way that everybody needs to be, and if everybody follows the rules, then we'll be okay. And then that becomes one of trying to force conformity, which the Taoists would then argue is why you have the rebellion in the first place, because people don't fit well into the boxes you're trying to put them in. But then for the Taoist, it is about a personal cultivation in terms of how do we manage, in a sense, our desires. And I think that is maybe at the level of the two competing things even today, right? Do we have an ability to cultivate a humanity in people that will avert this kind of death spiral, or do we have to just use a heavy hand and control people to keep them from doing it? And that's still getting played out, right? Which is the way to go with that. And I think the temptation is towards more of the heavy-handed move because it's easier in the sense of you don't have to get consensus. You don't have to get everybody to agree or for each individual to take up that role of how do I become a better person. They just simply have to fall in line or else. And that's maybe the trap or the temptation with having power to cause others to conform so that you can have the perspective that you want, right? Instead of recognizing how do we work with these interactive relationships that are much more messy and difficult to deal with.
Or it's just more effective. Daniel Schmachtenberger also talks about how China has a certain type of advantage over the U.S. in that whereas things in the U.S. can get bogged down in political log jams and endless infighting, in China the government just makes a decision uh, and it's just just kind of decides things unilaterally and says we're going to do this and everybody has to go with it, which affords it a certain amount of maneuverability as well as the ability to make longer term forecasts and longer term investments, which comes at the expense of all the problems of authoritarian leadership, but it it provides a certain competitive advantage in global maneuvering as well.
Yeah, the agility of not having to reach consensus or deal with populist questions and just being able to make decisions certainly is going to be more agile. And we see the same kind of question if we're talking even about business as opposed to countries where sometimes smaller businesses that have less of a hierarchy to deal with can be more agile, and larger corporations can become more bogged down because they get caught up in all the different layers, right? So there's definitely that question. What I find interesting still, and I don't know, I mean, and this is just more kind of an interest rather than something I've actually got a lot of research into, but there's this corporate organization way of organizing that's called holacracy, which is very interesting in that it's still a single organization, but it focuses more on, at the top level, the overall values, mission, purpose type of a concept, but then it delegates to each of its different divisions and even subdivisions a great deal of autonomy in terms of how they actually carry it out, so that you still retain that level of agility at a smaller organization, being able to make decisions and act while still fitting underneath an overall umbrella that's more broad in terms of the basic goals. And it seems to me that something like that could provide maybe a way of getting to that larger scale organization while not losing the agility that you would need if you were to do more authoritarian, but still have it distributed in such a way that you could still have that individuality in the cooperative organization between smaller units that are autonomous, but still underneath a larger umbrella, given that the umbrella would be such that it created enough space, right, for the differences. So I don't know, lots of possibilities.
It's funny you mentioned business. That's immediately where my brain went. Like, I worked at a large university and then I went to a smaller company, and it was crazy how fast decisions were being made in one versus the other,
Yeah.
because of bottlenecks and all those sorts of things.
Yeah. And then that also gets into the part that we saw in the second triplet where it was talking about the interference. And so part of that may be things like red tape, right? Like all the hoops you have to hop through in order to get something approved or to move forward, in order to have that more top-down control and not being able to delegate authority to lower levels to make decisions. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
all kinds of interesting. All right, well, let's see how they pull this chapter together then. It says, only those who don't strive after life. Now, if we think about what we were just seeing in terms of striving after the thickness of life, I think this is what that references to here then, that those who aren't striving after all these luxuries, or maybe my way at all costs, or different ways that people get caught up in, my life is more important than everybody else's type thing, right? Where they make those kinds of decisions. It says only those who don't get caught up in that truly respect life. And I think that really sums up well what the Taoist position is trying to do, is have that respect for life. But it's kind of an ironic situation where it's when you can, in a sense, hold loosely to life in the sense of recognizing its transitions and its transformations and how things unfold, rather than trying to protect it and pursue a certain angle. It's only when you can be more loose and let go of that that the real respect for life actually comes into play. Because, and I think this is more of that yin yang thing again, life is one side of that equation. The other side is death. And death is an important aspect of how life can even happen. So if we think for a moment, just from a biological or evolutionary perspective, the reason we transitioned, as Dane brought up earlier, where we had single cell organisms versus multicellular organisms and how that expanded into the diversity that we see, including ourselves, is because there had to be a process in which the changes that can be possible through the act of living that could become more advantageous and be passed on is only possible if there's a lifespan. The longer something lives, the slower the evolution happens. The shorter something lives, the faster things can evolve. And we see this with the problem of bacteria becoming resistant to the different ways that we try to treat them or whatnot, because they have a very short lifespan. They can adapt very quickly, whereas something like trees don't evolve very fast because they live for a long time. And humans are kind of in this spot in the middle where we've been able to actually become who we are because of the fact that death is part of the equation. So you can't have one without the other. And it's when you try to hold on to one side of that equation, life at all costs, that it can become so destructive to life in general, because now you're doing everything to protect one life or somebody you care about or a particular city's way of life or something, right? That's not being flexible or working with the natural flows of things, that things start to become very destructive. There's a couple of shows I've seen over the years where they play on this idea that you have a parent who's got a sick child, and in order to try and save that child, they're like literally willing to blow up the world in order to save their kid because it's their kid, right? And it's that dilemma that we find ourselves in terms of holding too tightly to the one side and not recognizing how the other side is actually also a gift. And so there's this paradox of letting loose, let go, letting things unfold, that actually seems scary because of the prospect of death or things changing. But ultimately, that's where the real respect for life comes from.
Yeah, I've seen in my family, even like some people have that my way or the highway kind of attitude over generations, and you can see the effect that that has had. Like on one side, it's very my way or the highway, and on the other side, it's very like loosey goosey, and you can really see the differences in how the people interact with each other and people that they love and just life in general. Like it's a huge contrast between the two. And we like to say, like, don't squeeze the soap, like if you squeeze the soap, it's going to slip out of your hand. So yeah, I try not to squeeze the soap in life.
Yeah, I like that. It is a delicate balance, right? And
Yeah.
I think our culture has become so anti-death that it becomes not something that's embracing life, but something that becomes far more destructive in its attempt to focus on life.
Yeah.
It's almost hard to say without sounding, morbid or cryptic, but there's just this balance that you can't embrace one without the other. You can't truly embrace life without also embracing death at the same time, because they're part of a package. They go together. You can't have one without the other. Well, that actually concludes the chapter. So we've got a little bit of time if you have some thoughts about this, or even maybe some other ideas that you want to bring up that maybe this brought to mind.
I think if you have kind of a um more of a respect for life in general, like you just allow things to be themselves, or allow people to be themselves, allow nature to be itself, and just become more accepting in general, or even just feed those things. Like I call it, gassing people up. Like whoever you are, you can be that person, and I'm gonna cheer for you pretty much no matter what. And because of that, I feel like I get a lot more of a unique experience rather than someone who's like, I don't want to talk to this person because they don't agree with me, or because they don't see the things the way that I see them, or because I can't control them. I feel like I get a lot more variety in my life, and I learn a lot more because of that. And I think it's really, I wasn't always that way because I grew up with a my way or the highway side of my family, and I used to be like that. But then I realized like life is a lot more enjoyable if you don't do that. It's a lot, I don't know if I want to say easier, but you feel like you can relax more when you let go and
Mhm.
just kind of go for the ride. And it becomes a lot more enjoyable. And I wish more people could see that and just let go of control or whatever it is that kind of riles them up. Because it's a lot more energy to do that. And it's a waste of energy, to be honest.
Yeah, because the end result is not actually achieving control, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah,
it's
you
always
just struggle for
squeeze
it. You're
supply.
just constantly swimming upstream for no reason. You're never going to get there. You may as well just grab a float, put some sunglasses on, and relax and just let it take you.
Yeah, when Dane was talking about the differences with the governmental ways of organizing things, and where China had more of an authoritarian rule, so they were more agile in the sense of being able to make decisions quickly. The other aspect he brought up was their ability to forecast and plan because of that control. And this is another area I think we see also at the business level is because everything is, we need to be able to plan, we need to be able to forecast. The only way you can do that is if you have aspects of control. And so there's this constant striving for more of a formula or a regulation or ways of keeping everything like cookie cutter in order to have the ability to forecast, because our whole system is based off of this illusion that we can at some point actually control things, which we can't. And so the forecasts are always off and the estimating is always off because there's just too many things that change. And so we've seen adjustments with things like Scrum or Agile ways of trying to manage projects. But really, I think where we would benefit more is in recognizing that there are these cycles, but how do we become more adaptable? And this would also be a key component of that Taoist philosophy, is that we have to be able to adjust. And the more we're prepared to handle those differences, the better off we're going to be in terms of navigating those things, rather than expending all this energy in an attempt to control that ultimately becomes very destructive and doesn't ever actually reach the goal of having control. Um, uh, Quite a mess sometimes.
Yeah.
Well, to me, it's obvious that control is a force in the universe, as well as chaos. And um, it's just as integral to life. I mean, the way that all certainly all vertebrates our design, including the human organism, is there is a very clear sort of top-down control of the brain to the body, which you could think of it as control, or you could think of it as information coordination. If it weren't for the fact that we have a brain that's connected by nerves to all these different parts of the body, we wouldn't be able to have a unique experience as an individual. We wouldn't be able to have motives and desires and the ability to move in the world and do things and meet our needs. And I tend to think it more in terms of like information coordination rather than control. I think control is really a proxy or a bridge to the coordination of information. So the fundamental question of how to manage civilization to me isn't how do you exert control over people, but how do you coordinate information effectively so that the different parts can operate can operate effectively, can operate in harmony or whatever. And one of the favorite things I heard Stan Groff say, I think he said that this was something from Swami Muktananda, who was giving a lecture, and said something like, the universe is perfect in its entirety. And somebody in the audience spoke up and said, how can you say the universe is perfect? There's suffering, there's injustice, there's all these evil things we've got to put a stop to. There's all these problems we've got to solve. And the Swami said, the universe and everything in it, including your desire to improve it, is perfect, just as it is. So I don't see control as an illusion. There is such a thing as control. It's not absolute or perfect, but to a degree, things can be in our control. The brain does control the body to an extent in certain ways. There are ways it doesn't control and things it can't control. But control is control. I've mentioned this idea before. Control implies there's a thing that's doing the controlling and a separate thing that's being controlled. But if you zoom out and look at everything as one thing, there's the idea of separate things itself is kind of an illusion. So the idea of control is an illusion in that sense. And instead of things controlling other things, what you get is an ongoing dance of energy and information that is just sort of playing itself out. There's no privileged position in there that could be said to be in control of anything else. We're all just participating in the stream of causality as the universe sort of runs its course.
Yeah. And I think maybe it's an issue of degree, right? Like, to what degree can we exercise control, and to what degree can we account for variables and for things that just are going to mess up our plans? But in the other part you're talking about, it's like saying, well, did we domesticate grains, or did grains domesticate humans? It's like, yeah, for a lot of things you can.
Also, the difference between dogs and cats.
Right. Yeah. So agreed. It's not that control isn't something that we don't ever see. Obviously, there's aspects of that. I think it's a matter of degree and to what extent we can apply that reasonably, right? And I think it's that overreach of thinking that it's possible to really control this a situation where, in fact, we need to be much more open to being adaptable. It's kind of like the weather. We can predict to a degree, but not very far, because there's too many variables and things change, and we need to be able to adapt to those changing circumstances. So it's, again, like you said, Dane, it's that yin yang. It's not that there isn't any control. It's that what degree or to what side do we cling to? Are we trying to stick with just that yang, or do we recognize there's also that yin, and how do we bring the two together?
Yeah, I took a training a few years ago, and it was a leadership training, and it was how to kind of lead people through struggles without like just giving them the answer or telling them what to do. And a big part of it was bringing to light and bringing to light for them the things that they can control and things that they can't control, and taking advantage of the things that they can't control and kind of releasing the things that they can't control. And obviously, one of the things that you can control is how you like perceive certain things and the angle at which you look at them. And um, I've used that a lot, I think, since I took that training, and it's it really helps to narrow the scope when you're facing a difficult thing in your life to the things that you can actually control, and trying to look at things in a different perspective and releasing things that you can't control or don't really have influence on.
And that was probably one of the biggest points that the Stoics were making in their philosophy, and certainly reflected in things like the Serenity Prayer, and yeah, it's an important lesson of recognizing that distinction.
Yeah.
And then once you jump into the determinist camp, the question really becomes, do we actually control anything? But that's a story for
Right.
another day. All right, guys. Well, this has been an enjoyable conversation. And if you've been watching this and you'd like to be a part of our Friday morning conversation, you can register your email at www.kinship.cafe, and you'll get an email each week with our latest video, as well as a Zoom link for joining our Friday morning conversation. And if you happen to be in the Southern California area where we meet on Sunday mornings. All right, guys, take care.
Bye. Thanks, Jim.